DuckTales is a series that hasn't had many entries, clocking in at only 5. However, the series is great, with some entries into it being better than others. Let's take a look into the entire DuckTales series of games. The first DuckTales game was released in September of 1989. The game was developed and published by Capcom, with legendary game makers Tokaru Fujiwara and Keiji Inafune working on the game, as well as some other personnel from the Mega Man series. The game is based on the TV series DuckTales, which is notable for being the first Disney Capcom cartoon created for syndication, which paved the way for other Disney series such as Chip 'n Dale Rescue Rangers or Tailspin. DuckTales was also the first licensed game internally developed by Capcom. The plot for the game is fairly simple. You're Scrooge McDuck and you're traveling the world looking for treasure. Rather than points in this game, you receive money from the items you pick up in the levels. The gameplay is extremely solid. The game is a basic side-scroller with a pogo stick mechanic that makes things really interesting. The pogo is your primary means of attacking enemies, and it can also be used to jump higher than you normally would. The ability is done by jumping and then pressing down and B. Depending on what controller you're using, this can be somewhat difficult to do, but on the basic NES controller it's fine. The game only has 5 levels: the Amazon, the Himalayas, Transylvania, the African mines, and the moon. Every level is drastically different from the others, and each have their own unique look and feel. The game also allows you to choose which level you'd like to play right at the start of the game, which makes the game non-linear like a Mega Man game. The levels are also interesting because there's no real straight path to the end of each level. Each level features branching pathways, which makes the levels feel way bigger and allows you to explore more. I really enjoy all the levels with the exception of the Transylvania level. The Transylvania level is annoying because it's essentially a maze that's linked together by mirrors that teleport you to different parts of the level. That combined with some hidden walls that you can walk through make the level fairly frustrating. Graphically, this is one of the best looking games on the NES, unsurprisingly because Keiji Inafune was the graphic designer. Every sprite in the game looks fantastic and is well represented of its source material. The levels also look great. The game is bright and colorful and utilizes 8-bit graphics to its fullest potential. DuckTales has some of the most famous songs of any NES title, the most famous being the track from the Moon level. The entire soundtrack for the game is fantastic. It was composed by Yoshihiro Sakaguchi, which also composed the first 2 Mega Man games. So many of the game's tracks are memorable and catchy, and they're wonderful. Overall, DuckTales is one of the best games in the entire NES library. And the game is still fairly affordable too, with its PriceCharting.com price of $14. The game is totally worth picking up and adding to your NES collection. About a year after DuckTales was released on the NES, a Gameboy port of the game was released. The game features similar gameplay and music, however the layout for many levels is modified to adapt the game to a portable release. This version of the game, while graphically impressive for an early Game Boy release, it just doesn't run well. Every time there's more than one sprite on the screen, the game experiences some significant slowdown, and these slowdowns also affect the music as well, making the music sound really weird and bad. The reduced resolution of the Game Boy release also hurts the gameplay slightly, as the ceiling on most levels feels like it's too low, which is detrimental to the pogo ability. This version of the game really isn't worth playing because of how stripped down it is compared to the NES release of the game. The low resolution and horrible slowdowns make this version pretty unfun to play. In 1993, a sequel to the original DuckTales game was released, called DuckTales 2. This game is a late-run NES title being released after the Super Nintendo came out, and due to this, the game is fairly rare and quite expensive. According to PriceCharting.com, DuckTales 2 is worth about $120 currently. There are many similarities between DuckTales 2 and the original game, however there are a few things they added in, like the ability to hang on hooks, as well as an easier controlling pogo jump. Instead of having to hit down, then B while in the air to pogo, all you have to do is hit B while in the air, and it'll just go right into the pogo. The hit detection boxes for the pogo attack have also been improved in DuckTales 2. You're also able to return to levels that you've already beaten, unlike the original DuckTales game. The game features the same level selection setup as the previous game, however, between selecting levels there's a considerable amount of text that you have to go through. DuckTales 2 is far more long-winded than the original game when talking to other characters. I'm not sure if it's a nostalgia thing, but DuckTales 2 doesn't feel like it's as much fun as the original game. On paper, it should be a lot better with the tweaks and upgrades the game got, but the level design isn't as good as the original, and the game feels somewhat bland by comparison. The graphics are slightly better than the original, but overall it looks like the same game. There's a better use of color in this game, especially with the enemy sprites, however, it's not really a significant difference. Overall, DuckTales 2 is a pretty good game, but it's just not as fun or interesting as the original. With the game's price being as high as it is, I wouldn't recommend it at the price it's going for. It's a solid game, however, it's not over $100 solid. A few months after the release of DuckTales 2, a Game Boy port of the game was released in late 1993. This version greatly improves on the original Game Boy title. This port is way more faithful to the NES version of DuckTales 2 than the original Game Boy title was to the original NES title. The game does still experience some major slowdowns when certain sprites are on the screen, however these slowdowns don't affect the music, which is a huge improvement. Gameplay-wise, the game does feel really good, and the game plays well for a downscaled version of DuckTales 2. Overall, DuckTales 2 on the Game Boy is actually a fairly solid Game Boy port, despite the slowdowns that the game experiences. 20 years after DuckTales 2 was released, in August of 2013, Capcom released Ducktales Remastered, an HD remix version of the original DuckTales game. The game was developed by WayForward, known for Contra 4 as well as Double Dragon Neon. There was a considerable amount of hype leading up to the release of the game, and it seemed like a retro gamer's dream come true. However, upon the release of the game, it was met with mostly mixed reviews. In DuckTales Remastered, they added a much more thorough plot to the game that involves the Beagle Boys raiding Scrooge McDuck's money bin. After Scrooge McDuck defeats the Beagle Boys, he finds a treasure map and sets out to find the 5 treasures listed on the map. The game has voice acting from the original voice actors in the TV series, which is amazing because the voice actor that plays Scrooge McDuck is currently in his mid-90s. Unfortunately though, the plot is actually one of the weakest parts of the game and a major detriment to the game. On many levels, the game will stop for dialogue, which can be tedious and it really draws you out of the game. Luckily, these parts are skippable by hitting start, but they cause major hiccups in the game. The Amazon level is particularly painful in the game, stopping for dialogue almost every minute or so. The plot feels like fluff to make a short game longer, but it really hurts the game. The gameplay is exactly like the original, with many of the levels being identical to the original counterparts on the NES version. Some of the levels did receive some modification from the original, but generally speaking, they improved the levels, making them slightly easier to navigate. I actually prefer the levels in the remaster over the original. The game also has a map added in, so it's incredibly easy to navigate these levels. In the remaster, they also give you the ability to choose how you want to use the pogo stick controls. You can set hard pogo on or off, which basically means you can switch between how it is in DuckTales 1 and DuckTales 2. One of the neatest things about the remaster is the ability to go swimming in Uncle Scrooge's money bin. There's really nothing to it, but it's a really fun feature they added in. Graphically, the game looks astounding. The sprites on the remaster are all hand-drawn and beautifully animated in crisp, clear HD. The environments, unfortunately, aren't as good looking as the sprites. The environments are rendered in 3D, which doesn't look necessarily bad, however it's a strange contrast between the hand-drawn sprites and the 3D environments that looks somewhat jarring. I really wish they had gone with the hand-drawn look for all the elements of this game. The soundtrack for DuckTales Remastered is mind-bending, it's so good. The game features remixes of all the original tracks from the original all done by Jake Kaufman. Jake Kaufman, who goes by the stage name Vert, has worked on a considerable number of modern gaming soundtracks, all of which are awesome. I say in a lot of my reviews that a game's music is good, but I wouldn't listen to it in my car. In the case of Jake Kaufman, I actually do listen to some of his tracks in my car. They're that good. The remixed versions of the songs from the DuckTales soundtrack are masterfully done, and it's easily one of the best soundtracks of any game in the last few years. Overall, DuckTales Remastered is a lot of fun. It has some major hiccups due to the cutscenes which detract from the overall funness of the game, but when you're actually walking around, this game handles great and it's a blast to play. I totally recommend DuckTales Remastered to any fan of the original game, or to anyone who wants to check out the series that hasn't played it before. The DuckTales series overall is fantastic. The games are simple, with a simple mechanic of pogo jumping. However, they're a blast to play, and they're extremely easy to pick up and play. The DuckTales series is totally worth checking out. For the most part, it won't break your bank to play them. I wouldn't really recommend playing the Game Boy games as much, as they're scaled down versions of the NES versions, but with how expensive DuckTales 2 is now, the Game Boy version is one of the only ways to check out DuckTales 2 affordably. If you get the opportunity to play these games, I'd highly recommend checking out any of them.